thing that really stuck.
Oh boy.
Recording in progress. Yeah, the thing that really stuck out to me is the character Ju. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but if not, please step in. Just like she's such, just the way that like desire rules her life and like ambition, and I just found it so compelling. And she's not necessarily likable. I loved her. I'm like, I mean, I like even when she does really terrible things, I could like see her and sense her and all those things. And also for me, the like reading of a genderqueer protagonist, well, two genderqueer protagonists with really different relationships to their bodies was really meaningful for me. And there's like I don't usually sticky books. There have been like a few standouts that books this year that I have stickied. And there were just a few passages, I think like the scene between Ju and Ma when like she disrobes was just really powerful. And I think like hit me in this way I had not been expecting when I was like, oh, here's a fun fantasy galley. But yeah, so those are like the big things that have stuck with me even now, like 8 months later.
Like someone asked me a while back, like, what are your favorite scenes in the book? And like my first response was like, oh, spoiler and also spoiler. But then one of my other favorite scenes was that scene that you mentioned. They always say like you write a book for just a couple of scenes, you want to get to that point. And I think that was one of them. And, you know, I find it quite hard to articulate a lot of what I was trying to express in this book. So I'm not necessarily a great author to speak to because I can't delve into like, this is exactly what I was intending. I'm like, I just throw everything on the page, take out of it what you will. But, you know, I kind of liked, I think I was clinging to this sense of something hidden as a strength, but then like the vulnerability to reveal that to someone else that came out in that scene. Like that scene was always there. Like the book went through so many drafts, but that scene always stayed. So I guess there was something important about it that I enjoyed. So I'm glad that you did too.
And I'll just say one more thing and then I'll really shut up for now. But I think something that was so special about that scene is you have these moments of like bodily reveal in fiction and in cinema all the time. And it's often like a really violent moment, or it's like the big, like a shocking thing. There's anger and like, I mean, I think that's a really harmful trope, but the way there was so much like intimacy and love, and also that like, I don't know, Ju has a really complicated relationship with gender, obviously, but also like feel, I don't know, it just really, yeah, wow, it just gave me chills.
But you're right, it is often a very, the reveal scene in any kind of gender bending book, yeah, is often like that thing that is dreaded, the source of tension in a story. But I was chatting to Lee Mandello the other day, who's a trans author that I'm friends with, and he said he got a bit of flack for a scene in which someone sees one of his characters' top surgery scars. And like, you know, he pushed back against that and said, well, you know, it's part of real life, the fact that people will see your scars. And as long as it's not treated in a shocking way, as a provocation, as a, you know, a trite plot point, then it should be, you know, something that you can include in fiction as part of people's lived experiences. You know, the bodies we have are the bodies we have, and you know, you can't hide them and, you know, keep them out of your fiction. So like Ju's body is maybe for a large part of the book not the body that she wants, but you know, it is what she has, and to show it to someone is that moment of vulnerability, just to say, well, this is part of who I am. It's not the totality of who I am, but you know, it's part of the bigger picture. And it can be that her relationship to it is quite complicated at the same time.
I love that. And I actually was like going through my tabs to Jake before we started. And one of the first things I tabbed was when like Zuda is bringing that up with her and saying like, you're my brother no matter what. And I felt like that was the first moment where we like get to see like, this is okay that she is the way she is and she has this body that she has. And that to me, like I was like, Zuda is my favorite person on this planet, even though he might not be real. This is it for me. So I love that we got to see that like so early on too, that like he accepts her no matter what. Yeah.
There's a great book I'm reading at the moment. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, and you probably have if you're bookstore owners, and it's Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. It's really good. I'm only about halfway through, but it has that same moment where like the character is trans, Katrina, and she gets misgendered all the time, and she's just always afraid of the violence that's about to like come at her when someone realizes she's trans. And she meets this violin teacher, and they're going into a store, and she's really worried because she knows that the store owners will like, attack her the minute they know that she's trans. She's just like, to the teachers, whatever her name is, Satoshi, maybe, there's something about me. You have to know I'm trans. And like the teacher's like, yeah, and like it's, I guess that sense of, I've seen this about you. It's just a fact about you. I attach no moral weight to it whatsoever. You're who you say you are. Like it honestly hadn't really even concerned me. And it's such a shocking revelation to Katrina that someone could even like be like that to her. It's really profound. And so Shuda is like the wish fulfillment BFF, he's just like, it's cool, you're who you say you are. I'm not bothered by it. It's nice to have a decent character in the book. Just one.
Yeah, because it's not like exactly that Ju herself is like a good, decent character. Like she knows that about herself, and like that's been some of my favorite part is like just like she knows who she is, and she's like she's ashamed of parts of it, but she's like, I'm gonna do what I need to do anyway. Just like fighting through that shame and the anger and like all of it, and like that the parallels with the generals not even the generals like journey, and like you can see how they're coming at it from two very different points of view, and like they both have these like heavy like shame, like shameful parts of themselves, not necessarily whatever like things that have been imbued with shame by other people, and so they are experiencing that shame, and like seeing how each of them like deal with that and like turn it into their power or their fuel and in some way. My favorite line, I wanted to write it down. I did. It was the general, the loathing, the shame, and the anger rushed through him as a series of escalating internal temperatures. The anger, when it finally came, was a relief. It was the cleanest and hottest of the emotions. It seared him of everything else that might have lingered. And that, like, knowing how like dirty a fuel like anger is for me, then like thinking of that as the clean one, like I cannot imagine the amount of pain that the general had been going through, and it's just like it gave me so much like pity, which is things that he doesn't want, and I was like trying to identify it. It was just like being inside of that head was just amazing. So I think my favorite character was probably the general, for that reason.
Yeah. Oh, poor old Ouyang. Yeah, he's terrible. So everyone asks me like, which character are you most like? Are you like Ju? I'm like, no. I know nothing about her. I actually don't understand her. She was extremely hard to write. She's nothing like me. But Ouyang has all the gender rage, that I think a lot of gender non-conforming people may have experienced just because of how they've had to be in the world and how people have perceived them. So he has a lot of issues, and it was just for him, I was just like, I channel a lot of rage into this character, and it's very cathartic, and I'm finding this really fun to write. It was very easy. Yeah. I sympathize with him, but he's obviously a terrible character and makes some really terrible decisions. It's like really sad to think about, like, the social forces that shape a person and that can create that form of rage. Like, I have just been reading this book. It's called The Right to Sex by Amir Srinivas. That's probably not how you say her name. She is a philosopher, and this is a book, I guess it looks at like the intersection of race and desire a lot. And one of her case studies is our friend Elliot Rodgers, the famous incel. And I think a lot of people forget that we think of incels as like the classic angry white man who feels very entitled to sex for whatever reason. But like Elliot Rogers was mixed race like me, and like in the same kind of way, like his dad was white and his mom was Asian, and a lot of his fury came from being a erased individual in the world. I'm not saying this excuses anything, but the fact that people saw him as this like effeminate Asian man, and he felt like that was not a desired body, caused that huge amount of his angst and rage and his fury against the women who he thought that did not desire an Asian man. I don't know. A lot of people call Ouyang like the original incel. Like he has that sort of same anger that is a result of being seen in a certain way, and it does not and should not excuse what he did. But at the same time, you can sort of like see the rationale behind it, or I like to think. I hope so.
Definitely. It like follows that rage to like a believable end. There's like no way, like at no point did I have to like stop and like suspend any disbelief. I was like, yep, all of this tracks immediately, and this is where we end up, I guess. And
self-destructive boys with their pain. Yeah, and like I was also leaning on the classic Chinese tragic romance. Like a lot of people are like, you're the author, you could have made it end differently. I'm like, I don't know, I'm powerless in the shape of like the structure of the romance. This is how they all end. I did want a grand tragedy in the book. I feel like it's always a very a central element of big Chinese epics, for better or for worse. Like I'm sure there are books that subvert that in excellent ways. And there are happy ending romances sometimes in Chinese dramas, but I feel like the tragedy is very juicy and often desired. So I had to include that in there.
The final scene on the causeway with Ouyang and Essen was like top tier. The first time I read it, I was going through it, deep breaths, and then I read through it, I had to read it again. And then today I was like ready for it, but I just thought it was everything with Ouyang and his suffering. And the suffering was such a like key element and theme played into the book time and time again, with its like Buddhist themes of desires and suffering throughout. But Ouyang, I might be in the minority. I loved him. I think there's only history thing I'm going to bring up, but like historically accurate eunuchs were used in Chinese dynasties for thousands of years. So it was very interesting to see him portrayed in such a unique way. And I could not. Yeah, I loved every bit with him in it. I thought he was just such a unique character that was driven by one sole purpose of revenge. And I think that helps that it's with revenge, but also the conflict of his own emotions for his own family, and then his not adopted family, but his forcefully adopted family too.
That's a tricky spot that he was in. Yeah, that was the scene, when people say, why did you write the book? And I always said, oh, spoiler. It's that scene. I always had in mind, I'm building up to that one scene, which, I don't know. It's a little self-indulgent. I always feel it's a little like, you have to have the stabbing scene between the lovers kind of thing. It was perfect. Crying as the blood trickles down. I'm like, I can see it in the C-drama. Maybe a little cheesy, but I had fun. I'm glad you enjoyed that scene. I did cry the first time I wrote it. And then by the 10th time I revised it, I was like, oh, these fuckers deserve it. Die. But that's just the writing process.
Libby, we can't quite hear you. Can other people hear her?
No.
Not at all.
The mysterious ghost of Libby the publicist, keeping an eye on all of us. Libby. No.
I do have one question regarding Ouyang. It's really just why you chose to, I guess, write him and have that character specifically him, how it was he was the eunuch who was driven through revenge throughout this whole book, even though the revenge isn't always straightforward. It takes a lot of times, especially after Chang'an is killed, essentially, you don't understand fully until later on that it was all his plan. But there are those little tidbits that you will plant throughout. So just generally, what made you want to write Ouyang the way he was?
Yeah, so he is the one character who's not a historical figure. So people are like, what's the deal with this random guy that you've inserted into history? He did not exist when I was originally conceiving of this story. It had initially been the figure of like this minor, bitter scholar lord who was the antagonist for Ju, and that was like the figure who is now Wang Baoxiang. But then I realized I needed someone whose gender journey in a way mirrored Ju. I needed a foil, and I couldn't find an existing piece of the puzzle, like of the historical figures that I had in play, that would provide exactly the right shape of story. So I did, in a way, I sort of like fissioned off another piece of Wang Baoxiang and turned him into Ouyang, which is why those two characters also have a similarity. I guess I kind of feel like I like to structure a book where you have a central theme, and then you have a bunch of characters who are like reflect that central theme in their own particular ways. So you do have this core, I guess, of just like gender. And then you have like Ju, who reflects it in a particular way, and Ouyang and Baoxiang, and like even Essen in his own way. They're all like reacting to this like theme of gender in a particular way. But I needed to have a protagonist and antagonist whose journeys like sort of mirrored each other in opposite ways. So as Ju rises, Ouyang falls. And I guess I wanted them to be mirror images of each other. And what is the mirror image of an AFAB in a way? I guess I wanted to I've always been like, I don't even know why, I've always been attracted to the eunuch characters in fiction and in fantasy. I guess it's that sense of having your gender like forcibly taken away from you. And like not all historical eunuchs experienced it in the same way. So Ouyang is in a sense a fantastical eunuch. He's not really a eunuch. In the story, he occupies this figure. I guess he's like an analogy of a AMAB trans man. Is that, he was a boy. He had his gender forcibly taken away from him. He now tries to reoccupy that space, but has it denied by the world. And that is a huge like source of his shame and rage. I wanted him to physically resemble Ju. So they're both like really small, slight figures. And I always like that image of like two people who meet each other and they look alike, and then they can kind of understand each other. So the only people like in the whole book who really understand Ouyang is like Ju and maybe Baoxiang. And he hates both of them. So that's like a nice cause of tragedy. Yeah, so just that playing with that idea of reflection and similarity and understanding. Like I think, when you're often a marginalized person and you have this hidden identity, you deeply desire understanding. It's the one thing you really want. But at the same time, when someone like looks into your soul and sees like this little part of you that you haven't fully come to terms with yourself, that's quite painful and it feels a bit private. It can feel really violating too. So then that sense of being violated is often erotic. So these are just things I was playing around with, and that's sort of what led to this particular figure. So it wasn't really out of any historical basis. It was more out of like, what do the story needs? What am I interested in? And then the whole revenge thing is like tied to gender as well, because like, he is the filial son. Like he feels like he has to have that at the core of his identity in order to be a man, which is, a misconception, because we see that there are many ways to be a man, and he doesn't actually have to cling to this sense of filial piety that Confucianism tells him is central to that. But he can't let go of it, and I guess that's his tragedy.
Yeah, it's really cool hearing you talk about how they were sort of mirrors for each other. And Jake, you joked like, oh, I'm team Ouyang, but it's so hard to be like team one or the other, because it's like if you get why one of them is
100%.
making their choices, like they are reflection. I mean, I guess Ouyang's a lot more driven by rage. And in a way, I would say like Ju's driven by fear, almost like fear of a life she doesn't want to live. So it's like they are sort of foils, but they choose such different paths. And like you were saying, Shelley, like their paths come in conflict with each other. So it's not like they could both rise. Or although maybe book 2 is going to be like an epic romance and they rule a kingdom together. I doubt it, but
I think you'll see them occupy the same page a bit more. So you don't see them interact that much in this book, but in book 2, what can I say? That's not too much of a spoiler. I think we see an enemies to reluctant allies plot start to develop. So they do work together a lot. I think Ouyang is like shame powered. Like there's so much shame baked to him, and Ju is almost a wish fulfillment character. Like she has that courage to step outside of her gender box, and most importantly, I guess from my sense, as an extremely shame feeling person, so Ju doesn't feel so much shame. She's just kind of like, I'm just going to forge ahead. I don't care what you think of me, you know, as a person. Obviously, she was worried about having her like AFABness discovered, but she doesn't really feel shame about it. She can feel fear about it, and a dislike and an anger, but I don't think she's really ashamed of who she is. And that's what I liked about her.
I feel like I appreciated, like going off of what you're saying, like almost the ease of like how she became who she was. Like there were all these circumstances that like obviously led her to where she was, but she never felt, I feel like she never questioned like that this was who she was meant to be. And I felt really good about that and appreciated that about her. And I think that was like really powerful to see, especially from such like a powerful character, because I feel like she's just so powerful. And I think that really comes from a place of like confidence in who she is. And yeah, that I loved getting to see that.
I was reading this book recently. I think it's called The Hero's Body by William Giraldi. It's a really interesting memoir. It's about masculinity of like 3 generations of this Italian-American family in New Jersey. That sounds boring, but it's really interesting, but I digress. He quotes someone else who now I cannot remember who's quoting, and it was talking about what is heroic. And I always have this thing where people are like, is Ju a hero or an anti-hero? And I'm like, I don't really know. But he quoted this guy who said like, the true hero is someone who becomes who they are. And that's like, which is a bit of a weird tautology, but it's like the unheroic person is the person who flinches from becoming who they're meant to be and doing what they're meant to do. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that or not as a definition of heroic, but it did make me think of Ju. Like her story is about becoming, and she has the courage to become who she believes she's meant to be. And she does what she feels like she's meant to do. She has that courage, and that's sort of, to me, was that core of her. Whereas like a lot of other people in the book kind of flinch from that. Like Ouyang will do what he feels like he is meant to do, but it's not really internal. It's coming externally, and he doesn't really have a very strong sense of himself, I think, as a person, really. Like I was chatting to I was at an event, it was again with Lee Mandello, and we're talking about, do our characters have preferences outside of like, you know, the world that we have described them as being in? Because people often ask questions like, what's the star sign of your character? I'm like, I don't know. You know, what's their favorite food? Fuck if I know. I have no idea. And Lee just like made up some random stuff like, oh, I guess my character likes chess pie. And I'm like, I don't even know where that is. Because they live in the South or something. And I'm like, oh, what do my characters like to eat? Like Ouyang literally has no preferences. He's not really a person. Yeah, which is kind of sad if you think about it. He's a shell moving through the world, a shell of revenge. Whereas Ju is more of a person. I guess she has some preferences here and there.
She'd like to eat in general. Like whenever there's
Yes.
food, she's like, that one, thanks.
Yeah, there you go. She's not picky. She'll eat whatever. I think at one stage she expresses a preference for some kind of food. No, I can't remember. I think they're like little sesame balls. They're like these little deep fried dough things, and they have sesame seeds on top. And I had to Google it, and they did exist in the Ming Dynasty, which I was very pleased about.
I'm thinking about the peanuts that you mentioned earlier. Like peanuts didn't exist, but like literally they're in like one page, the very beginning, like in part 1. So like people are really worried about that.
It's not the peanuts exactly. That's the example I use because I guess I'm very aware that peanuts didn't exist in the 14th century. And I wrote that because I guess that was my little shout out to one of the research books I was reading at the time, which was a description of the famine in China during the Great Leap Forward, which is during a very different time period. So when was that even? 40s, 50s, 60s. Huge famine. Peanuts were definitely in China by that time. But because that was the book that I was using to like try and imagine what a famine would have been like. So he described in this book about the Great Leap Forward famine, how people were eating like the bark of trees and they were like digging up the peanut sprouts and stuff. So I was like, I'm going to put that in. I actually am quite aware that peanuts didn't exist back then. But yeah, no, people will nitpick anything. Like for instance, the names, can't win on names, Chinese names in fiction. Like if you write their full names out, so in Chinese books, in web novels, everyone uses their full names every time, like surname and first names. And people often have a lot of different first names. They'll have a name that their family use. They'll have the courtesy name that strangers should use. It gets very complicated. And I don't know, if you're unfamiliar with Russian names, you might have had that experience of reading classic literature and just being like, I can't keep any of these characters straight. And you'll just like latch on to like their first name starts with R and their last name ends in a V. And you just kind of like, you're wading through this mass of characters. So yes, so I was advised to prune the names down in what is like a non-standard way for Chinese literature and use of their surnames in the main narrative. And so a lot of people who are familiar with Chinese books will be like, well, that's not how it's actually done. And I'm like, oh, well, Western audiences not used to the names. Like try and find that middle path, but you can't please everyone. And to this day, I still get both sides, on each side going, the names aren't accurate. And the other side going, I can't keep track of all these Chinese names. And I'm like, give me a break. So anyway.
As someone who's read some classic Chinese literature, I appreciate that, because having to keep up with all the names and like the Lotus Flower and just like old like Ming and like Tang Dynasty books, this was much better. Thank you.
Well, I had that problem where, because they're historical characters and they come with their names attached, so I had a Ju and a Shu, and I was just like, no one's going to be able to handle that. So that is why Shida is always referred to by his full name and not just his surname alone, because I was like, people are not going to be able to handle those two characters in close proximity all the time with their names practically the same. And people don't like X's. I get a bit freaked out. How do you say the X or the Q or the C? Yeah. Anyway, so thank you for, reading it.
Judah was one that
Delving.
kept getting me because I'm dyslexic, and I think I was texting Courtney about it, and I was just like, Zadu, like I just renamed him in my head, and I was like, okay, whatever, as long as they like stay as separate people. I don't think it really like your new name is Zadu, apparently. Sorry.
I mean, the problem with historical as well is, at one stage I had like 6 characters with the same surname because they're all part of the same family, right? They all have the same name, Zhang. And I was just, so you have to start giving them nicknames to like get by. So that is why some of them have nicknames.
Well, I feel like that's
And
the
Chinese namings.
sorry.
I
was just gonna say it's the least believable part of fiction for me is that it's like in my life everyone's named Sarah and Emily, and it's like why
Yeah.
are there not 10 characters named Sarah?
Yeah, so this is the part where the craft starts showing through, like the architecture of storytelling, where you're like, oh, isn't it interesting how everyone's name kind of says a little bit about who they are, and coincidentally, no one has the same name. Yeah. Oh well.
The
Okay,
other thing, like oh
you
sorry,
go, Kat. No,
JB.
you go.
Okay. The names, because the names of the cities were different depending on who was telling you about the city, and like that became like a plot point, like adjacent, because of the way that Ouyang and the Zangs, sure, we're going to like betray Essen. Then like that became significant, the like language change. And so when I started noticing it, I was like, wait a minute, something's happening here. Like we wouldn't just, like I was noticing the craft in that, because like you wouldn't just like throw the extra names in there without like a reason, because you had like changed some of the other names and like stuff like that. So like that was like, I guess it tipped the hand a little to me. I was just like, wait, this is important. And that was actually kind of very interesting to me, like noticing it, I guess, before.
Yeah. And it's
became
confusing.
something.
It's confusing, but you can do things with it as well. The fact that people are speaking different languages and what language they're speaking can have a plot significance as well as just being like a functional logistical thing. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of simplification involved, for sure, which I tend to feel bad about, because like I sort of know how much I've simplified especially the linguistics, like because you're writing a whole book in English and you're like, well, people speaking Mongolian, people are referring to various cities by their historical names that has a particular significance, and whether you're referring to it by its like old Chinese Song dynasty historical name or like a different way. So having to prune that into an intelligible way for someone who doesn't know any Chinese history is also like quite difficult. Like I'm glad it came through in an intelligible way, because like sort of you're not quite sure how it's going to land. Yeah. Anyway, and it's not like I speak Mongolian, so I'm always constantly feeling really sorry for my like Mongol rep, you know. But I know 14th century Mongols are somewhat different from current day citizens of Mongolia. Yeah, you do the best you can do.
Can I swerve a little and bring us to a different character point? So I feel like every time I think and talk about this book, I'm also really fascinated by Lady Rui as the sort of like most underrated character. The whole like sequence with her. Also, I'm not sure if she is a historical figure, so maybe you can speak to that a bit, Shelley. But I find her so fascinating because I think she is also a foil to Jew in a lot of ways. Like she represents like the limitations of like societal expectation and trying to do what you can with the power you have and the role you're given. Although again, she deals with it really differently than Jew does. So I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on her character, but also Shelley, like what, what it was adding her to the story and like what you feel her significance is as well.
Anyone else want to weigh in before I monopolize the conversation? Yeah, Lady Rui, she's a bit of a precursor in a way to a theme that I'm going to explore a lot more in book 2. So that's been a lot on my mind through another character. So she is a foil for Jew. She's not a historical character. She's just a plot point character, really. But I think it was the first way I touched on that. Yeah, well, I'm trying to think what I was actually intending. As I said, I'm not a very critical writer. I'm just I throw it on the page and think about the meanings later. I think what my main intention with that sequence was that Ju has an understanding of what it's like to be a woman that other people in her role don't. And that is her strength. She is at first afraid of using it. She fears that it diminishes her, this knowledge of what it's like to be a woman. And like, I was trying to build on that gradually throughout from that point onwards, that Ju realizes what that knowledge that she has, that is a result of her upbringing as a girl, and her empathy for people who are female is a strength that she can use, that a lot of other people who are in a male role of leadership and have always been male don't necessarily have. They've sort of had this very sequestered life, and if you're a man, you sort of say, oh, women are not that useful, they're not even like really people. So I think that was more my primary aim in that sequence, that like Ju's like, I understand you, and that scares the bejesus out of me because I think it's actually a bad sign. And then at the end of that sequence, she's like, I feel like I should have the mandate of heaven, but I don't. And yeah, she's not really quite believing it. So the whole mandate of heaven thing is just like, how much do you believe in yourself? I think it's just a matter of, it's just a confidence game, really. If you believe that you have it, you will have it. Because it was just a tacked on thing after the fact. This book actually didn't have any magic in it when it sold. So that was an additional layer added after the fact. But that aspect of like looking at how women navigate the world and use the power available to them is something that I'm going to explore a lot with the character of Madame Zhang, who is the courtesan character. And she runs like the Salt Empire off on like the East Coast. And she is a courtesan. She's like partially based a little bit on the famous female pirate in China, Qingxi, who is the subject of a bunch of other fiction books. Actually, there's one that just came out called The Clash of Steel, which is a YA book that features this like badass pirate woman who like runs her own pirate empire in the south of China. And she was known as like Madame Qing. So Madame Zhang is sort of semi-based on that character. And, she's the puppet master behind the scenes. I guess she has this useless husband who she manipulates, but in a very feminine wiles kind of way. She uses the tool she has at her disposal, which is like how she looks and her sexuality, and keeping a man happy in a particular way, and then like behind the scenes running this brutal like mercantile empire, and doing all like the backdoor deals that her husband doesn't see. And then he just sort of thinks that everything's falling into place, because of how amazing he is, and he's literally done nothing. And this woman behind the scenes is just like, I do it all. But then also what I'm going to look at with her characters, I guess the limits of that kind of power, where you have to do everything behind the scenes and you cannot actually stand up and claim it for yourself. So the kind of character who sees their highest position as empress, but never goes as far as Ju, who thinks that a woman could be emperor. So yeah, I guess Lady Rue was like the start of that journey, but I finish it with a different character in book 2. And we'll see how far Madame Zhang gets in her ambitions.
It's funny that you mentioned Madame Zhang, because JG, when you were mentioning about how with Lady Rui that occupying a certain space and then finding the power that society almost overlooked, and then they were able to gain that power and almost influence the way they could. I felt that way about Madame Zhang. She's not sleeping with her husband. Her husband is just a drunk, essentially. And she's running this whole empire up and down the Grand Canal, with the salt. So it's clearly an economic powerhouse, and she's really the one in charge. So I'm excited that she's a part for book 2. I'm just excited for book 2. I'm gonna stop though.
Yeah, I like her. I've been writing her at the moment, so I'm still suffering through the manuscript of book 2. So it's always very much on my mind. This is the pandemic delayed sequel that should have been finished like 6 months ago, but is not yet finished. But she's been a fun character to write. It's been a while since I've been inside like a really femme character's head, because I don't necessarily identify with that. But she's a good boss lady. I enjoy her journey, so I hope you will too.
What you were saying about like being or Jew having like the understanding of like I have been a woman, or like I have an understanding of being a woman even though I'm no longer occupying that space, is something that I've heard like multiple trans people, not people in my life like talk about, but also like Jackson Bird, like people who are out here like making content about it. And it's always been like a super interesting conversation for me, because like how when like when you're living in the world and presenting in a certain way, then like everybody on the outside, if they haven't like known your story, then like how do you continue to like provide your voice to a conversation that like you don't have the right to be in anymore, kind of thing. That's like been something that like sits on my brain weirdly. And so,
Yeah,
like,
I thought that kind of thing, it was also on my mind as I wrote that sense of political solidarity with an identity that you left behind. Like no one wants to be like I'm like a slightly older queer generation than maybe you guys, I don't know. Chaz Bono was like, you know, someone who transitioned and turned into an absolute dickbag, you know, misogynistic jerk. And like then you saw the portrayal of trans men on the L Word, and it was seen as betraying a lesbian identity if you transitioned. And it's just like really not very useful. And I wanted to resist that, you know, that sense of like you can transition and you know you're still part of that community that you left behind. You have a solidarity with it, and looking for that sense of inclusivity of like a overall queer uplifting. Why does it have to be like I leave one community for good and then or I have betrayed it in a sense? Like that never sat well with me. So I wanted you to be a genderqueer person who's no longer female identified, you know, has that solidarity with women. That I think that's an important part of her character. Yeah, I think at the time I was reading stuff like the Argonauts, Maggie Nelson, Asterix, like let's not believe everything that Maggie Nelson says. But that was, I found that really affecting when I read it the first time, which was about 10 years ago now. But she was talking about her partner's transition and how it turned them into what looked like a heteronormative like couple on the outside, and she felt like her queer identity was like sort of being subsumed in a strange way. And like I was just thinking about that, not necessarily agreeing with what she said, but like thinking about that when I thought of like Ju and Ma together and how they look like a, you know, het couple, but like, you know, they have a essential queerness that the world doesn't necessarily see, but that does inform the way they interact with other marginalized people and how they interact between themselves. And it adds a significance to Ju's achievements that maybe the world doesn't necessarily see if they only see a man sitting on a throne. But the fact that Ju and Ma know that Ju is not actually a man, I think is important.
One of my favorite parts that I marked was it's closer to the end when Ma is taking Ju's like pulse and says like, you know, it's a wonder that only this person knows, like everybody can tell you have a woman's body just from, you know, your pulse. And then it goes into that whole thing of like how she always longed for like this perfect male body and doesn't feel that way anymore. And the part that I marked that I loved so much was that where it says Ju didn't have a male body, but she wasn't convinced Ma was right. How could her body be a woman's body if it didn't house a woman? And just like everything about that was so, it was like, oh yeah, that's true. you know, everybody's body is their own body, but like to see that thought process and like see that realization come, I felt was like so wonderful.
Yeah, it always feels a bit risky to put it on the page like that, because like it's stating it pretty boldly, and you just wonder what people are going to take away, whether they agree or whether their own thinking will change, like when you're committing to a statement like that. But it felt true at the time, you know, like we aren't what our bodies are. You know, I was writing this book not well before, but like TERFs were not quite as prominent a political force and like social force as they are now. But you know, that sense of like, why should the biological determine your gender was on my mind even back then, and probably even more so now. And that, you know, in ancient Chinese medicine, it was definitely believed that, you know, your pulse will tell you an essential truth about not only what your body is like, but who you are. You know, a lot of fortune telling involved reading your pulse and like touching your face and, you know, all the unchangeable, like biological sex, I guess. So I wanted Ju to push back against that and be like, you know, my body is part of me, and, you know, I guess who I am on the inside, you know, influences how people should react to my body. Like, you know, I don't know how much power I really have over how other people perceive us, but I just wanted to play in that space. I'm not quite sure how it's all going to play out in book 2, but I guess we'll see.
Well, I definitely appreciated it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was just gonna say it led kind of into like the next thing that I tabbed, which was again like something that was just for me like very special to see on a page, because I think it's something that so many people who identify like as a gender nonconforming identity experience at some point. It's like the goal to get there when we get to the point, I think it's page 344 in my copy. I don't know if that's the same for everybody. But it's when Zhu is like taking a bath, and she says, for the first time since her adolescence, she looked down at her body and didn't feel aversion, but simply the fact of herself. And I, again, like just felt like that was so powerful to see and like get to that point. Yeah.
Mel, I have that one tab too. Like literally, I just flipped there and I was like, wait, there's a tab.
Love that.
Yeah. I don't know, that's been on my mind as well. Because book 2, I suppose, like Ju has undergone a radical physical transformation that has, in a sense, eased her dysphoria. It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know how far I'm going to take this, but it was interesting to think of, you know, people who have top surgery, and, you know, that immensely eases that sense of like, you know, I feel like I've become more myself with this change to my body. And I hadn't actually intended that with like Ju losing her hand in that story. That was actually a very late addition, which I was extremely worried about, because like when you lop off a part of your character's body, it does have long-term repercussions, and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to solve. But then like post facto, I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. You know, that physical transformation made her more herself. And it led to those moments where she could look at herself, strangely enough, and say, this body is now mine, actually. You thought you'd done a violence to me. You thought you'd like, you know, sent me into this pit of shame and despair and social ostracism, but actually it was the best thing that could have happened. It's made me who I, you know, wanted to be, that maybe she wouldn't have thought of otherwise. I don't know. I'm not sure if the analogy fits perfectly, and I'm still exploring this area, because like we have a whole book where Ju is one-handed, which was not something I necessarily envisaged when I started off writing. Yeah, but that was important to me, that sense of, you know, a moment where you can feel a bit more at ease in a body that for so long, you know, you've been afraid of and felt like was your doom attached to you, you know.
That's the one that got me too, was like, you've done the worst thing that you thought, like Oyoung did the worst thing that he could possibly imagine. And she was like, "Meh, I got this." And it's just like understanding like the differences between them and the similarities. And it's like, you have taken, like Oyoung had taken all of the steps to get where he was, and it had led to like the only inevitable choice. Whereas Zhu had like had similar situations confronted with her, and she was just like, I can do something else. And like the creative problem solving that like you see in all these like I don't know, it gets complained about like in TV, where it's like conveniently the main character can just solve the problem, but like it didn't feel contrived in here. Like it was just like the way that she had already just taken the problem of like her life and solved it in a way that like nobody else had noticed, was just like, it didn't feel weird when she just kept solving problems in weird ways by like, you know, like fighting without fighting, and like all of these things. She just kept twisting the narrative, and just like, I don't know, it was, yeah, the one where it's like, you've given me the worst thing and I've flipped it on its head because that's all I got to do.
Yeah, that's part of that mirroring thing. I guess like I wanted to have a very similar thing happen to both of them, but because of who they are, they react to it in their own like idiosyncratic ways. Yeah. I mean, I like to start with character and then just see where that takes you. Like, I'm not really a plot writer, and I guess you can see that because I did not write my own plot. I borrowed my plot from history. It's like history fanfic. I'm really only interested in character and, you know, how those people move through those set of plot points, how those people move through the world, how they react to similar events in their own very specific ways, and then what it says about them. So yeah, I mean, it is contrived, you know, the fact that that would happen to both of them, like a mutilation very specifically. Like I said, it was something I added in later because it felt right. It felt like I needed that mirroring, even though I was very hesitant. And I have to say, a lot of my beta readers were like, what about just a little scar over the eyebrow? What about just a little facial scar? And I was like, oh, if you're going to do it, you have to like commit. You have to go all out. You know, like Oyoung's mutilation was life-changing in a way. What happens to Ju has to be life-changing. Well, it has to be of import. It can't just be like I randomly got my earlobe chopped off. So
yeah, because if you got your earlobe chopped off, like, are you going to even notice that in the second book? Or like now you've got a whole book with one hand.
Well, there's also like the perennial fantasy problem, which is why so many people are missing hands in fantasy book. Is like, how much can you lose in the medieval era and still be functional? And well, actually, you know, we're probably not giving creativity enough credit. Like if someone lost their leg, I mean, it's less common to see, but you could definitely have a character who was missing part of their leg. You just have to expand your thinking about how bodies move through the world, I suppose. But anyway, hand is like an easy out. But also, I mean, I was influenced by Star Wars. Like I always say, like the core of this book is the classic farm boy's hero's journey. It does have a Marvel Star Wars core of like, you know, a hero's journey. And so the hand missing is like a classic, you know, yep. Good old Luke Skywalker.
And Anakin.
But also, have you read The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner? Like that's a classic YA series featuring a very trickster king. You first meet him and he's just this like mangy little thief. And you gradually realize that he is in fact the prince undercover. And he's just a classic trickster character. But he does get imprisoned by this ferocious queen of a neighboring country who, like, she's like an ice queen, and she fully chops off his hand. And then they actually fall in love, partially because of how badass she is that she chopped off his hand. But he is the one-handed thief king, which is pretty amazing. I don't know. It's a great series, and she just finished it. I think she just wrote the 5th book in that series.
I've been writing down every book you mentioned so that I can go back and look at all of them. I
Val,
wanted
are
to
you and I
say
the same?
I wanted to say too, a book you mentioned before, you were like, oh, it's like kind of whatever because it's a New Jersey Italian American. Like I'm from New Jersey and I'm Italian American, so I'm definitely gonna read that one. But yeah, I'm gonna read all of these books probably that you've mentioned so far.
Yeah, one of my greatest
I
reading
mainly read
hacks
nonfiction.
Well, what nonfiction books are you looking forward to? Because I love reading authors I love reading the books they love, because I feel like their influences. So are there nonfiction or fiction books that you're excited about that are coming out soon or that are out already?
I'm not sure if I'm looking forward to, I try not to look at the advanced TBR. I can tell you what I'm reading right now, or I just recently read that I really enjoyed. Olivia Lang, who is a non-binary author of like sort of lyrical nonfiction. She still uses she, her pronouns, I believe. So she wrote Lonely City, which you might have heard of, which is it's a really great book about art and loneliness in New York City. And I think a lot of people latched onto this during the pandemic, but she wrote it well before. She has a new book, it's called Everybody. And she sort of interweaves this really interesting, that's her central thesis is pretty basic, but it's just like, wouldn't it be nice if we weren't constrained by societal perceptions of the bodies we're in? It's just a very basic, speaking as a non-binary person. But she looks at through the historical lens of this one character who is a psychoanalyst from the post-war period, Wilhelm Reich, I believe his name was. He was a sexologist, an early sexologist. It's just really fascinating to look. I guess it's a fascinating look back at queer history of the 1960s, 70s, how it interwove with the free love movements, psychoanalysis. But then just moving forward into, an optimism for the future where maybe we are not all going to be judged by the physical carapaces we're inside, but only as people. But it's just really well done. And it offers a lot of like historical perspective on where we are now. But if you're interested in like bodies and gender and stuff, it's really good. What else have I been reading? The Right to Sex is a really good book, but I have not finished that yet, so I cannot give a precise of what it's about. There's another book, Isle Press, I think that's how you say his name. So I read 2 books by him, but the first one's called Dirty Work, which is about how rich societies shove onto their poorest and most disadvantaged people, not just the physical dirty work of keeping societies going, like running prisons and slaughterhouses and stuff like that, and drone warfare, but also like the moral weight and how that is really immensely destructive to people who, have to shoulder that burden. Like, when you are the prison guard in an unjust prison system and you see people being beaten to death, what kind of toll does that take on you, and like what obligation do you have to, as a disadvantaged person, you're often the poorest person with the least power in society. Like, what power do you have to speak up? And if you can't speak up, what toll does that then take on you? But then also the complicity we all have as people in the society who are benefiting from this, like, I guess it's going back to this like tacit idea, like in Nazi Germany, regular Germans might not have been 100% aware of what was happening, but as a society, they gave like a tacit approval to that there is a problem, a Jewish problem, and it must be solved. And that as a society, they implicitly condoned what was happening. And so that's the parallel that is drawn to what like we're doing today. Anyway, it's really interesting. I recommend it. It's called Dirty Work.
when She Who Became the Sun was being, I guess, advertised, I first heard of it, I think, off of like Goodreads back in like February or March. And the main tagline was that it was the Song of Achilles meets Mulan. So I have two questions. One, did you have any say in that? And two, do you agree with that?
The
That'll
eternal
answer it.
problem
Awesome.
of comparative titles. I did have a say in it. It was, in fact, I guess, my own invention, for better or for worse. When you send out a query letter to your agent, to people who you hope will be your agent, you often add in comparative titles. It's hard when you're writing a book set in a non-Western milieu, to find appropriate comparative titles. And you're speaking to a predominantly Western audience of agents and publishers who like, how can I communicate what my book is about? It's necessarily reductive. So Mulan is basically just saying, this is a book about set in China, in the historical China, and it has battles, and it has a gender bending component. This has caused me endless grief now, though, because people are like, it's a Mulan retelling. I'm like, that's not how comps work. It's really just there to tell you a kind of like a taste of like, what's it like? So endlessly, people are like, it's Mulan, literally Mulan. I'm like, it's not.
It's literally
it's
not.
one of the only touchstones that people know, and we did have conversations about this at the publisher, like, what are other comps that there could be? Is like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or some of those, and people, they're not modern, people don't know them, they don't have any great significance to people who come across these titles. It was just like, ugh. So anyway, Mulan it was. Literally the only Chinese thing that people know. And, then Song of Achilles was more for the tragic gay element, we did ponder whether it should be Circe instead, because that's a bit more of a feminist, a feminist retelling. Although I hesitate to call my book a feminist retelling. I guess it could be. I don't want it to be solely a feminist retelling. I don't want it to be feminist in the sense of excluding the queerness, which I think often, unfortunately, happens these days when people say something is feminist, and that gets yanked into this whole like political discussion of women, biological women versus everyone else. I don't want to go there. That's not what my book is. So Song of Achilles. And anyway, that was before Song of Achilles became massive on TikTok. So then Song of Achilles did become massive on TikTok. And I was like, well, that's very fortunate. So we'll just go with that. So yeah, I was lucky. I don't think not all people get to choose their comp titles. It's more like I just offered them and they said, that works. So we'll stick with those. Or maybe because, Mulan like is literally the only one there could have been. So
That was something I brought up with Melissa when I first saw this book, especially the Song of Achilles parallel, because Achilles' main, like, not trope, but he's given the choice of die in obscurity and live a long life or live a short life and reach greatness. And essentially, Zhu is trying to escape the fate of nothing and then go for greatness. But then that's, besides the gender tragedy, that's kind of where it ends. And the same thing with Mulan. So I always had personally gripes with those, not that gripes with you choosing it, but I always felt like there's so much more to the story than just that.
I've thought
comps
about
are necessarily reductive. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say, well, in defense of comps from like a bookseller's perspective, especially when like Song of Achilles is blowing up, it's really nice to like have this book I really want to, get folks to read and to have that comp there, because then they're like, ooh, Song of Achilles, oh, I'll read that. But it's interesting that you, if we were going to take like the framework of Achilles, that you were seeing Zhu as Achilles, because when I think about the Iliad, it's really a story of like Achilles' anger. It's like the
Oh,
story.
all rage.
Yeah, it's like rage is the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I see him more in Yang,
Yang?
also because like the end of his story is, you know, he doesn't get to be with his lover, although I guess that's a more active choice on his part than on Achilles's.
Definitely active.
But at the
If I
same
had to
time,
say
like,
which
The
one of them
most
is
active.
Achilles,
I feel like they both, like, whether it be directly or indirectly, like caused the death of their lover. And I think personally, as somebody who like loved Song of Achilles, loved Mulan, I was like super drawn to that tagline. I was like, heck yeah, my two favorite things like thrown into one. This is going to be amazing. And I felt like it had my favorite parts of both of those stories and so much more, that it was a good like way to describe it for me to be drawn to it as somebody who like doesn't know a whole lot about Chinese history and loved both of those things. So I felt like, you know, I don't know, I thought it was okay.
although my greatest fear
I
with
think
the
it has been
Mulan
effective.
song- oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, I just think like there have been many people like you, Mel, who found it a useful tagline, and I'm really grateful for that, for sure.
Yeah.
I was just going to say about the Mulan comp that I think what really scared me when I read it and then saw people who hadn't read it yet being like, oh my God, Mulan meets Song of Achilles, must read. I was like, oh, but like, it's not so simple. Mulan is a woman. Mulan identifies as a woman. I was like, don't dilute the queerness. And then I think as people did read it, oh gosh, I don't know if you can hear the sirens. Sorry. As people read it, I think they were able to pull that out of it, but that was sort of a fear I had of like, I don't want people to make this into like, yeah, I don't know, because the gender pieces spoke so much to me. I felt really protective of them.
I think too, like oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, in my thought process of Mulan, like, I like to pretend that Mulan is queer because I think that would have been more accurate. And I feel like this was kind of like, obviously it's not a Mulan retelling. It's not any kind, you know, that's not the point. But I think it gave like people who loved Mulan like a new perspective of like, oh, maybe Mulan could have been queer, or like maybe even though like Disney wanted us to believe that every single princess deserves a happy ending with a prince, that doesn't actually have to be the case, because like she could be her own prince, you know, or maybe whatever it is. But I felt like it was a way to like reimagine what Mulan could have been, but in a whole different way with new people and new characters. And I thought that comparison helped to reshape my idea of Mulan, rather than like make me compare this to what it could have been differently closer to Mulan, if that makes sense.
Like definitely the 1998 Mulan was really formative for me. Like Li Shang, our first Disney bisexual hero, you know, that was very meaningful. And I really identified with the Disney Mulan. Like I found it, like it was the only kind of like, it was the only thing that was kind of close remotely to like, you know, representation of that queerness, even though it wasn't really about that. And like this book is in conversation with, I guess, the original Mulan as well, like the old Chinese Mulan, which is not about gender. It's about a woman who identifies as a woman who chooses to set aside her gender for the sake of filial piety, to go and battle, you know, the threat to the Confucian system that she lives within. So she's willing to sacrifice something of herself to protect the entire system that upholds gender. So she, you know, voluntarily gives up her femaleness to temporarily go forth as a, you know, a son and defend Confucianism. She succeeds. She comes back and she reassumes her female role. So it's about nationalism. It's not really about gender. It's, you know, about doing what you have to do to protect the system. So I was a bit like, I want a story, a Mulan type story that is the opposite of that. That's about, I'm going to go forth and bring down the system of Confucianism that holds the genders in their particular like places in this, this rigid system. So it's a little bit of a fuck you to like, Confucianism and like the original Mulan. But at the same time, I did love good old Disney Mulan, the original one, not the new one. The new one was bad. I'm going to say it. I did not like the new one. I really wanted it to be amazing. I was praying for it to be good. And I can absolutely pin the fact that this book has not been optioned for film yet, because like there were people who were interested, and then Mulan tanked, and then everyone was like, holy shit, we are not spending $100 million on anything Chinese ever again. So anyway,
that is devastating. That is I haven't even seen the new Mulan, but that is
it's not don't
watch it.
It's heartbreaking, JG. It's heartbreaking because we all wanted it to be so good.
Yeah. We just really like, give us one good thing. So the pandemic also killed Mulan. And then Shang-Chi came out, and the pandemic has killed that in Australia. So all the Asian Australians are just like furious. We have not been out of our houses for like 250 days. We're just like, just give us one good thing. Give us our one big Asian superheroes on the big screen, Yes, anyway, we're talking about Mulan. I know, I finished my thought on Mulan.
I had a thought on Mulan, but I forgot it, so.
I had one question on, this probably be my last one. I know I'm just talking up a storm here, but what your imagery is like top notch. There were so many moments in your writing when you're describing either landscapes or just the little moments in intense situations. I think it was the moment with Lady Rui and Zhu when the scarf gets knocked off and Lady Rui sees Zhu's Buddhist monk scars. And then at some point, I forget what they say, but then you bring up how they can smell the incense in those moments. And it's just like the almost tension breakers. My big question was with the mandate of heaven and how it would be embodied by the different people. The Mongols would have the blue flame, the classic red flame representing the Chinese dynasties, but then Zhu has the all white flame. Was that on purpose, or did that kind of just come out of not like thin air, but you needed some differing colors?
Oh, this is too much of how the sausage is made. Yeah. Also,
we can skip this if we don't want to.
No, it's okay. I mean, the whole idea of them having to have flames. So this book was not a fantasy. I sold it to Tor. Tor is a fantasy imprint. And, they really understood what the book was. So I was not unhappy. Like, I chose Tor. And I had the luxury of choosing Tor. But they did say it would be slightly easier to place in the market if it had a supernatural element. And so what I did was like lift out everything that was implicit in what characters believed. Like they already believed in ghosts, they really believed in fate, they really believed in heaven. Just slightly made it like literal on the page. And it forced me to think a little bit more broadly. I think it enabled me to come up with some interesting solutions to some plot problems that there had been. But then I was thinking, the mandate of heaven. It's just really a way of visualizing like people's belief. Like I think there are some characters who truly believe that they are worthy of it and can have this potential. And I think it's interesting that some characters like Zhu can have it, and someone like Madame Zhang, for instance, who, especially in book 2, see she is a worthy, she is someone who has just as much ambition as Zhu has. But can she see herself in the role of emperor? Can she see herself holding the mandate of heaven, which is only for men in her mind? I don't know if she can. Anyway, I kind of like the idea of literalizing it in the end, just to show like who can see themselves in that role, even if that role was never meant for them. But the colors, I had to give them colors. I was really thinking back to Tamora Pierce. I don't know if you've read the classic like Alana books, and they have this magical system where everyone has like a gift and it has a different color. And the colors are really arbitrary. But anyway, so the Mongols have what, blue, that's the color of their flag. The red turbans obviously had to be red. The Salt Empire has, what is it, orange? Like that's the color that salt kind of burns. But Jude has brightness. Jude doesn't have a color. And I think that becomes very significant in book 2. The Ming dynasty. So Ming means bright. So it's all about radiance. So the series title is The Radiant Emperor, and the Ming dynasty is the Bright Dynasty. Because I had the luxury, because I have to suffer having written book 2 so much further after book 1, but it gets to have the supernatural elements baked in from the ground, which means I can do more with ghosts. I can do more with the Mandate of Heaven. It becomes more interesting, and maybe a little better woven together than just an element tacked on top. So the fact that Jude has brightness rather than a color, I think, is important. So I'm gonna have fun with that one.
It also leads into your Star Wars thing, because like, the Kyber crystal picks you. So
there's actually a extremely Star Warsy thing that I have borrowed for the epic conclusion of book 2, and I'm still a little on the fence about whether I should do it or not. But like, once you have this like power of brightness kind of thing, and yeah, and there's another character who has shall we say, the power of darkness. So it's like very Star Warsy. But I mean, I'm a nerd from the beginning, so maybe I should be true to my roots. I guess we'll see how it all pans out. All right. Any more questions? Any more general chat? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I tabbed probably half the book. I'm not gonna go through all of them and like tell you everything, but I'm so excited for book 2. Thanks for like sharing those little tidbits with us, because I'm even more excited, and I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I think I really enjoy the story of book 2. I just really like to have it have been written already, so I could also enjoy it. But I think I'll be suffering for a while yet. So unfortunately, you guys are gonna have to wait till 2023.
Oh,
I think it's
okay.
coming
I was
out.
about to ask.
Spring 2023. I'm sorry, pandemic delays. It was supposed to come out summer next year, summer 2022.
We'll
we
wait.
pushed it back a season.
Yeah, we'll be here whenever it happens.
So I did have another question. You said that like editors or betas were telling you that like you needed to like pare down the names. Was there also at some point like a discussion of the pronouns? Because like, I don't know, in a perfect world, like what would Zhu's preferred pronouns be? Like, would they be she, her, or would it, like, I don't know, would it be more masculine or something different, or what?
So I guess if you believe that everyone in the book is speaking Middle Chinese or Middle Mongolian, like Middle Chinese, before the 19th century didn't have gendered third person pronouns. So in my head, Jude doesn't have a gender pronoun. But okay, we're writing a book in English. You have to choose a pronoun. Yeah, I know this was definitely on my mind, especially it's interesting the reception as well that people have to Ju and Ouyang because of their pronouns. For sure, Ouyang's pronoun being he, him has made people envisage him as so much more masculine than I feel like I described him on the page. Like when I see the fan art of just like, a hot warrior dude, or maybe just a pretty, but definitely a dude, I'm like, that's not what I intended, but I can see that you're projecting due to his pronoun. I think that's kind of interesting, that interplay between, that tension between pronouns and how bodies are perceived and how people perceive themselves. Would I have written a whole book with Jew using pronouns they, them? I don't know. I'm a bit like, I'm very grateful that we have the ability to choose our pronouns much more than we had in like the past, even like 10 years ago. 10 years ago when I started writing this book, the use of they, them was much less prevalent than it is now. So I've actually seen that change in real time. At the same time, your pronoun doesn't define who you are. I think Jew can use she, her, and still be just as non-binary, just as genderqueer as she would be if she used they, them. Like, it doesn't say anything about her as a person. Maybe it signifies something to the broader society she's in, or maybe to the readership. But when it comes down to it, she's just only a person in a body. Like, I kind of feel like those two things shouldn't be as tightly connected as they are. Like, your pronoun should not determine your identity. I don't know. It's all a bit in flux.
I definitely love all of
choices
it.
we have to make. Yeah, I know. Like, and the fact that there is a gendered word in the title, like, does like suggest a kind of, it's always been very important to me that the person who occupies the throne at the end, and it's not a spoiler to say that Jew becomes the emperor. Like, it was very important to me that she is not a man. A convenient shorthand of saying that, I guess, is to have a gendered pronoun in the title of a book. But then, yeah, it does bring with it that like opposite problem that people see her as a woman. And I do slightly resist readings I've seen that have been like, this is a story about a woman who becomes emperor. And I'm like, that's not what it's about. Or that's not what I intended it to be. And I do see those like very de-queering feminist readings of this book. I mean, you can take what you like into a book. I'm not going to tell you what to read, but that's not what I intended. Yeah, and like, could I have completely stopped that from happening by using different pronouns? Well, I don't know. It's a thorny area. You can never choose, I think, the correct solution. It is what it is. Would I have written it differently now? Maybe. But books take a long time,
Yeah.
and 10 years society changes around you.
Well, I thought there was something very interesting. I mean, she doesn't just use she, her pronouns in the book. Anytime we're in a point of view that isn't hers, we see he, him pronouns. And obviously it's like they're perceiving, those characters are all perceiving Jew as a man, and therefore he, him. But there was something quite like subtly subversive about that even though I guess she uses she, her pronouns for herself the whole time, just to see her like navigate the two different pronouns, I thought was in the way that some people now say like, oh, I use two different pronouns and you alternate. And that for me really was like a strong element of like sort of queering the pronoun usage in a less maybe overt way.
Yeah, I definitely like, the reason I ask is because like I would prefer to use just like any pronoun. Like, I don't want to have a choice or like to have a preference. Like, I just want whatever happens. But also that becomes more of like, people are seeing my assigned female at birth body and they are automatically applying the she, her pronoun without giving any extra thought into like other parts of my identity or like presentation or any of that. And so like, seeing both pronouns, he and she, applied to Zhu, like, felt really good to me. I just wanted to make sure it was like, I don't know. I was worried that like an editor had said like, there's too much of it and you had like taken some out. And so like, I don't know.
No, I never got any editorial notes on that at all. Like I said, like, Tor is really good with queer books. That's part of the reason I went with that imprint. Absolutely understanding. Had I written an entire book with they, them, Tor is definitely the imprint that would have, been like, make that happen. That's fine. Yeah, I like the idea that someone once said that gender is Ju's superpower, and like she's like fluid. She gets to slip between it and use it, as she will. And I liked that sense of like slipperiness and hiddenness and secret strengths that you kind of see when people are perceiving her one way and using a pronoun like he, him. And then she uses she, her, but then she also uses a lot of the other third person pronouns first person pronouns that exist in Chinese. Like you can say this person, this monk. There is a specific pronoun for emperor, which is really powerful when you see it used in Chinese dramas. And I guess at a certain point, you'll be able to bust that out. It's kind of hard in a book that's only in English, but like there is a pronoun that only the emperor uses to refer to himself. And that's why it's really powerful when a character ascends to become emperor and for the first time refers to always himself with that pronoun. But then also it's really, it's always a lovely moment. Sometimes an emperor will slip and refer to himself with a regular person, first person pronoun. And you're like, oh, there is a person under the emperorness, I've seen that used in really fun ways in Chinese dramas. So there's a lot of scope there for playing, and it kind of, I'm sad that English doesn't like allow the full use of that. So we kind of struggle on with what we can do.
Okay, that just made my day. So thank you.
I was just gonna say too, when you said that people say that her superpower is her gender, it reminded me of another book that I read recently where like that's literally the case. I don't know if anybody else has read it. It's called The Brilliant Death.
Oh, yeah, by Amy Capaldi.
Yes. So
that's a really good one.
I loved it, and it does kind of remind me of that, where it's like the going back and forth and using he, him, and she, her, but actually literally like magically shifting between he, him, and she, her, and like masculine, feminine, even like male and female body. So yeah, the rest of you should read it because it's very good.
It has a sequel too. I haven't read the sequel yet, but
I haven't either.
Yeah, non-binary witches. It's really cool. Or straight up, is that what they called in the book?
I think like somebody actually recommended this book to me because it's magical and it's about gender and it's about a mafia family, which is like all the things I love. But witches, that's right up there too. So I'm definitely gonna have to read that one.
There's some cool non-binary sex scenes in like this. Maybe I have read the sequel. Gosh, it's been a while. That one's been out for a couple of years. But I remember just being like, oh, this is blowing my mind slightly. This is awesome. I recommend it.
Love that. I'm definitely going to read it. I actually read Once and Future first and then realized that it was one of the same authors. I loved that. That was, yeah, I'm going to have to get the sequel. Does anybody else have any questions specific for Shelley?
I have a very quick question. Shelley, you've alluded quite a bit that you love Chinese dramas. I'm wondering if you have recommendations for any that are on streaming services that you would suggest newbies start with.
I'm not the person to ask for this because I'm really out of date. Like I was watching Chinese dramas like back when I started writing this book, which was many, many, many years ago. And there have just been so many since then. Like when I started writing this book, yeah, Chinese dramas was something you watched on like, the dodgy scraped sites with the dodgy fan subs. And it was all very legal. And now it's all on Netflix and it's so accessible and that's amazing. But I also have not taken advantage of it. A lot of people love The Untamed. The Untamed is not from me. I don't know what it is about it, but it doesn't tickle my fancy. But it's also quite hard to get into. I think at first, my understanding is you must skip the first 3 episodes and start on episode 4, because otherwise it's just like hard to get into. Because it's structured as a giant flashback. It's like the 35 episode flashback. And my tastes are also like I really love a palace drama. I do not love wuxia or like cultivation fantasies, which are what are really popular right now. I just really love a classic 80 episode. They're all in the palace and there's a lot of like off-screen battles, but people are like backstabbing their way to power and possibly to sleep with the emperor and stuff like that. So that's actually more of the classic roots of She Who Became the Sun than the current crop of really popular, like, you know, gay BL Danmei, like Chinese dramas that are blowing up right now. But Word of Honor is pretty accessible and quite pleasant to watch. I watched a couple of episodes. I've read the web novel. That's fun. That's by one of my favorite authors, Priest, who writes just great stories in general. So, and they're all gay, super gay, and they have happy endings mostly. The dramas don't, the TV dramas don't usually have the happy endings, but her books have happy endings. So the web novels might be, you can watch the drama, then stop watching before the last 3 episodes, and then you go to the book and you read the book's ending. So. Anyway, it's been lovely talking to you guys. I better like leave because my family are like dancing in the background going, we need to go to the beach. Because it is like Sunday.
Anytime.
Oh yes,
So I
you're a
should
whole
probably
day
bust
ahead
away.
of us. Thank you so much for chatting with us and joining us. We are so grateful that we got to have this conversation with you. I know I can't wait for book number 2, and I will just be here anxiously waiting, ready for it. But yeah, thank you so much. This was so great. We really appreciate you coming to hang out with us for a little bit.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's always lovely to like meet people in sort of real life, you know, as an as a pandemic author. We haven't gotten to meet anyone who's like read our books yet. So this is really nice.
We'll be there when you do your in-person tour in 2023.
Yes, that.
But yeah, thank you so much, Shelley, for coming and chatting with us and revealing secrets about book 2.
Yeah, it was an absolute blast. Thank you.
Thanks all. Have a good Saturday night.
Thanks.
Yes.
Wild. Just